begin. So my closing remarks for today are centered on helping us think through the current landscape of climate change and the politics of building coalitions rooted in anti-colonial and feminist perspectives. Indeed, I'm speaking to you today as a feminist political organizer myself, as a scholar, a woman of color who has learned from strong and powerful feminist traditions, indigenous feminism, black feminism, and anti-colonial internationalist feminisms anchored in the global South. So I'm keenly invested in this question of what a radical feminist praxis can offer us in this moment, past, present, and future, all wrapped up in one. And I'll be using Indigenous North America or Turtle Island as a reference point for raising questions about accountability and responsibility. So I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, depending on how fast or slow I decide to move through my presentation, which can vary. And then we can open it up for discussion, because I'll be excited to hear from all of you. So with that, I'll start. So they called it the heat dome. The hottest temperatures ever recorded in the US Pacific Northwest and far southwest Canada appeared in the summer of 2021 with the force of an invisible slow-motion siege. Meteorologists tracking the silently rising tidal wave of heat broadcasted maps painted in shades of crimson, alerting a sleeping public to a summer gone blazing red. The headline said it all. This summer could change our understanding of extreme heat. Sweltering temperatures expected across the US due to heat dome, and Western Canada burns and deaths mount after the world's most extreme heat wave in modern history. Created through a high-pressure system that causes the atmosphere to trap very warm air and precipitated in part through heat emerging from increasingly warming oceans, a heat dome produces extreme temperatures at ground level that can persist for days or even weeks. In British Columbia, Canada, thermometers were registering the air at an alarming 49.6 degrees Celsius, with similar highs in the states of Washington and Oregon, immediately south of the border, exposing US and Canadian residents to the type of extreme weather events countries in the global South have been experiencing for years. But this kind of heat does not just live in the air that we breathe, it envelops everything it touches, leaving a tale of death, destruction, and urgent questions about the future. For climate scientists who've been studying the intensification of heat waves over the last decade, the results of the heat dome were predictably devastating. The British Columbia Coroner's Service identified 569 heat-related deaths between June 20th to July 29th, and 445 of them occurred during the heat dome. A human body exposed to severe and relentless heat is a body under duress, a body working overtime. When subjected to an elevation in air temperatures, our bodies draw additional blood to the skin to dissipate heat, a natural cooling system designed to maintain optimal body temperature. This process becomes more strained when the temperatures continue to rise without the reprieve of cooling. Oxygen consumption and metabolism both escalate, leading to a faster heart rate and rapid breathing. Above 42 degrees Celsius, enzyme and energy production fail, and the body is in danger of developing a systemic inflammatory response. Eventually, multi-system failure can occur. And human beings were not the only things impacted. According to an article published in The Atlantic in July 2021, billions of mussels, clams, oysters, barnacles, sea stars, and other intertidal species also died. A number of land-based species also fared badly, buckling in the sweltering and suffocating air, creating a dystopic tale of desperate and dying wildlife. To put it plainly, the physiological stress of extreme heat on living organisms is life-threatening. In particular, for human beings, baking to death is a real possibility if you do not have access to cooling systems, or if you are one of the millions of people who live in parts of the world where climate change has increased your chance of exposure to extreme heat and comprehensive adaptation strategies have yet to be developed. Our bodies are not meant to work this hard under these kinds of conditions, and neither is the planet. So how did we arrive here? A rapid attribution analysis of the heat dome conducted by a global team of scientists revealed that the occurrence of this kind of heat wave was virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Their results came with a strong warning. Quote, "Our rapidly warming climate is bringing us into uncharted territory that has significant consequences for health, well-being, and livelihoods. Adaptation and mitigation are urgently needed to prepare societies for a very different future," end quote. the situation is only expected to get more dire. 3 billion people could live in places as hot as the Sahara by 2070 unless we address climate change with radical action and address it now. The sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recently released, mirrors a similarly grave picture of our current climate reality and forecast of what lies ahead. In a bold oppositional move against national governments who have edited the findings of such assessments in the past, a group of scientists leaked the third part of the report, which reveals in unequivocal terms how fossil fuel industries propped up by state governments are some of the largest contributors to our current environmental condition and what needs to be done to shift course. The report reminds us that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years, with a near linear relationship between cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions and the global warming they cause. This means that we are no longer waiting for the arrival of climate change, which I'm sure everyone here already knows. It is here. It lives in the stifling hot air we breathe during unanticipated heat waves. It is the reason droughts are becoming more severe, and at the same time, flooding is driving millions of people's lives into chaos, precariousness, and displacement. It explains why Arctic ice has reached its lowest level since at least 1850. Ocean acidification exists because of it. And it is the driver behind environmental conditions that are expected to produce 200 million climate migrants over the next 30 years. We do not need more evidence. The science could not be more clear. The answer to how we ended up here, however, cannot be collapsed into a homogenized, all of us are to blame scenario that does little to differentiate how countries like the United States and other Western nations have produced the vast majority of carbon emissions that have led to this point of immense and disastrous planetary change. The United States has contributed more to the problem of excess carbon dioxide than any other country on the planet, with the largest carbon footprints made by wealthy communities. The higher the household income, the greater the emissions. In fact, a Scientific American study recently explained that the United States, with less than 5% of the global population, uses about a quarter of the world's fossil fuel resources, burning up nearly 23% of the coal, 25% of the oil, 27% of the aluminum, and 19% of the copper. A recent Oxfam report confronting carbon inequality provides staggering revelations about the ways that the correlations between wealth and carbon emissions extend out to the global context. The richest 1% on the planet are responsible for more than double the emissions of the poorest half of humanity, and the richest 10% in the world are accountable for over half of all emissions. Wealthy individuals and communities, though, are not the only source of dangerous and excessive carbon emissions. Global corporations, of course, dedicated to the ongoing development and flourishing of fossil fuel energy infrastructure, are also a major, if not the largest, part of the problem. If we zoom in even further, it becomes apparent that the relationship amongst racial capitalism, colonialism, and climate change lies at the center of a critical understanding of the Anthropocene, given that colonialism and capitalism together laid the groundwork for the development of carbon-intensive economies that have prioritized capitalist accumulation in all of its destructive forms at the expense of everything else. As Potawatomi philosopher Kyle White explains, with respect to specific experiences of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, quote, the colonial invasion that began centuries ago caused anthropogenic environmental changes that rapidly disrupted many Indigenous peoples, including deforestation, pollution, modification of hydraulic cycles, and the amplification of soil use and terraforming for particular types of farming, grazing, transportation, and residential, commercial, and government infrastructure. These critiques are not new. Indigenous leaders throughout the world have been sounding the alarm about impending ecocide derived from the never-ending cycle of extraction and consumption for as long as settler colonies like the United States have been in existence. Again, Kyle White captures this beautifully when he says, quote, anthropogenic human-caused climate change is an intensification of environmental change imposed on Indigenous peoples by colonialism. In Wastelanding, Legacies of Uranium Mining in Navajo Country, Tracy Boyle similarly insists, quote, although scholars of environmental justice studies most often focus on contemporary, post-1982 examples of environmental injustice, Native Americans are quick to note that the tendency of those in power to exert their power by manipulating resources and degrading the natural environment is something with which colonized peoples are all too familiar. In fact, the most workable date for the founding of the Native environmental justice movement is 1492, end quote. The temporal sensibilities that animate liberal environmentalist concerns are distinct from the sense of time experienced by Indigenous people who have had to survive environmental catastrophe since the initiation of the colonial project. From the vantage point of Indigenous resistance, the environmental crisis is coexistive with the time of colonialism. Resistance efforts to halt the contamination and toxicity from industrial projects then must be simultaneously linked to a long-term strategy of advancing Indigenous resurgence and governance systems that demand a different relationality to the land and the water and the air. The settler colonies of the United States and Canada have always been preoccupied with questions of natural resources, the desire for them, the management of them, and the ability to translate them into profit. All of this is an important reminder then that a social, political, and economic arrangement of our world that is anchored to colonialism and imperialism has resulted in massive disparities in terms of disproportionate impact. Race, class, and gender are deeply interwoven into the experience and violence of climate catastrophe. In the Global South, the crisis has been producing perilous and deadly climate-related events in numerous countries for well over a decade, well preceding the notable arrival of the heat dome in the United States and Canada in the summer of 2021. In Sudan, for example, temperatures are consistently rising, water is becoming more scarce, and severe droughts are commonplace, producing major problems with soil fertility and agriculture. Southern Africa is warming at twice the global rate. 2019 alone saw 1,200 climate-related deaths. Bangladesh, often referred to as ground zero for climate change, despite having contributed as little as 0.09% to global cumulative CO2 emissions, has experienced a major surge in flooding, which has resulted in the destruction of millions of homes, created numerous obstacles in crop production, and caused an alarming escalation in food insecurity. People all over the globe are living on the front lines of a planet-wide crisis that has been produced far outside the boundaries of their own communities. To make matters worse, climate researchers from the Global South face multiple challenges obtaining funding for their projects and getting their research in front of the global community of scientists, largely from Western states, who are driving the agenda of adaptation. COP26 was illustrative of this problem of access. Given the uneven distribution of vaccines for COVID-19, many climate organizers and scientists from the Global South, as well as Indigenous leaders, were unable to attend the conference that had been heralded as the last chance to save humanity. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that COP26 was such a catastrophic failure. There is a profound power imbalance within the context of climate crisis, which sits alongside vital questions about social inequality and shared responsibility. In the face of such grim and devastating projections, sidestepping into the hopelessness trap seems like the easiest place to land, but millions of people across the globe do not have the luxury of retreat or denial. And if we consider the long game, none of us do. How do those of us who are determined to act on climate change think about what it means to actualize global solidarity and mass mobilization within the context of this historical moment, where everything is at stake? What are some of the political guideposts that should lie at the heart of what it means to be a climate organizer? One thing that immediately comes to mind is that our mobilizations around climate change and environmental justice must be guided by an internationalist framework that is both anti-colonial and anti-capitalist. A consistent focus on the way that here is deeply connected to there and there is deeply connected to here necessitates that we never lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of people in the world who are staring down the devastation of climate change in this moment have not had a hand in producing it. We can take our cue from youth climate organizers in this regard. In Philadelphia, as a case in point, activists with Youth Climate Strike have been mobilizing protests in the streets while operating with a direct line to internationalism, linking struggles for environmental justice in their neighborhoods and the places in which they live with the devastation of climate crisis in the global south. Their organizing transcends geographical boundaries, demanding that those of us in the global north open our eyes and act on our responsibility to communities locally and to the rest of the world for a climate catastrophe that is in large part created in the United States. As Sabir Mahmood, the daughter of immigrants from Bangladesh and a youth climate activist, explained to me, quote, "I knew these problems of flooding and rising sea levels, cancer rates, and displacement existed in Bangladesh, but I never connected the dots," Mahmood said. "I just thought that was their normal. I didn't realize that it's partly because of climate change and countries like the United States not taking responsibility for their actions. Countries that have little to do with the creation of climate change are really being affected by it. The United States needs to own this," end quote. A framework of internationalism, however, must also include foregrounding a critical analysis of the way that racial capitalism continues to wreak havoc on the planet. Indeed, countries like the United States function as part of a much larger constellation of imperial projects that produce great suffering, initiate catastrophic death, and remake ecologies and modes of relationship in order to facilitate the movement of capital. The Zapatistas knew this in 1994 when they made their first declaration from the Lacandan jungle. The Standing Rock stood in opposition to this when they launched their epic battle against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016. And indigenous communities in Guyana are pushing back against this right now as they organize in response to the expansion of Exxon's oil extraction, which expects to send more than 2 billion metric tons of CO2 into the atmosphere in the next 3 to 5 years. A related reason that an internationalist and anti-colonial framework is so vital in this moment of climate organizing is that imperialism goes hand in hand with environmental destruction. That is to say, imperial projects such as the United States' 20-year colonial occupation of Afghanistan has not only left countless Afghan citizens in a situation of immense danger and precariousness since the reinstatement of the Taliban, but has also left the country in a state of environmental wreckage. This destruction is evident in rampant deforestation, which proliferated during the turbulence of such a long war, and a rise in toxic air pollutants that were released by US armed forces through trash burning and other military activities, and are making Afghani people chronically ill because they increase the risk of cancer and other diseases. Defunct military bases also require environmental remediation before the land can be used for life-giving instead of life-taking purposes. A recent report from Brown University's The Cost of War project, which I really encourage you to check out if you haven't read, it's a pretty incredible project, confirms that the United States spends more on the military than any other country in the world, substantially more than the combined military spending of Russia and China. The use of military force requires a great deal of energy, and most of it comes in the form of fossil fuels. As a result of this massive commitment to militarization, the United States war machine is one of the largest polluters on the planet, with the cataclysmic damage extending out to other colonial projects supported through US tax dollars. The war finance nexus ties the United States and Canada to Africa, to the Middle East, to Latin America, to Asia, in short, to all places where international finance capital moves. The billions of dollars that have gone in to support the Israeli military, for example, has enabled immense environmental ruination in Palestine. Bombs and related lethal weaponry are intended to destroy, not to build. And the afterlife of such destruction continues to impact the air, the land, the water, the plants, animals, and people who have lived under conditions of war for years, even after a war ostensibly comes to an end or an occupying force ostensibly withdraws. This means that a robust climate justice movement must necessarily include demilitarization in order for an internationalist agenda of ecological justice and sustainability to be realized. In order to make internationalism happen in the spaces and places of climate organizing, however, coalitions must also be part of the answer. Those of us who are the most privileged have a responsibility to do the hard work of building multiracial and anti-colonial feminist coalitions between different social movements, collaborating across political and geographical borders, multi-issue coalitions that foster self-reflexivity and allow us to understand one another better, to decipher the ways that our worlds have become co-constituted through a series of lived experience and historical material relations. Racial capitalism, as it is fueled by colonial and imperial projects, works through all of us. It becomes entrenched in even the most seemingly benign social practices and ways of being. It shapes our collective and individual memories about who we are. In essence, it plays with what it means to be human, how we develop relationships to one another and the world around us, how we eat, how we breathe, how we love. Part of the labor we have to commit to doing has to do with understanding how this happens in order to identify the things that bind us together and determine how best to unify in a collective struggle to save the planet. In this regard, a crucial aspect of the climate justice movement should involve creating platforms where people can engage in debates and dialogues about power and history in their everyday mobilizing efforts. Through these interactions, people can knit together their social positions and experiences of oppression, marginalization, and resistance while being attentive to the specificities of particular struggles. This resonates with Afro-Caribbean scholar and activist Jackie Alexander's call for feminists of color to become, quote, fluent in each other's histories, end quote, and Black radical feminist Angela Davis's plea to foster unlikely coalitions. Multiracial and anti-colonial feminist coalition building of this sort has the ability to speak loudly to a politics of interdependence, to become a powerful counter to political echo chambers. It allows us to set forth a challenge to re-educate ourselves and confront head-on our blind spots about history and present, and to explore how nationality and citizenship status, class, race, gender, sexuality, age, and ability, among other factors, produce social realities and lived experiences that are tied to one another, but also very unequal. We can start to see linkages between social issues and communities all over the world that are often positioned as separate and removed from one another, and prompt those of us situated in places like the United States to adjust their organizing efforts, networking, and platform building in a manner that addresses these inequalities in practical ways to begin to shift power dynamics. Wherever these coalitions come into being, Indigenous leaders must play a fundamental role given global histories of land dispossession and ongoing colonial occupations, and because they offer critical guidance and anti-colonial blueprints for how we can actively shape a decolonizing path moving forward. Indigenous peoples have clearly demonstrated that other kinds of worlds are possible, worlds that are built on care, reciprocity, interdependence, and coexistence, as opposed to structural violence, dispossession, and domination. And they are currently protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity and are often the most confrontational arm of environmental resistance movements worldwide. The perspectives they bring forth present glimpses into the kind of imagination and offer and give us alternative ways of building relations with one another and the world around us, a guidepost for beginning to conceptualize and embody decolonization centered on the restoration of Indigenous modes of relating that privilege interconnection and continuity. They offer us a series of lifelines. A centralized focus on environmental justice is not about creating an isolated silo in which all of us committed to this work can go about our business. It is about understanding and acting upon the foundational significance of decolonial knowledge, history, and resistance in everything we do. And this means supporting the work of Indigenous leaders across the world who are charting a different path into a future across multiple avenues of social, political, and economic life. The environment, of course, is everything. It's everywhere. Turning towards Indigenous resurgence also demands centering decolonial epistemologies and cosmologies that challenge dominant colonial and Eurocentric knowledge systems while promoting the dismantling of the social and political and knowledge-based infrastructure necessary to sustain a white settler society, a decolonial epistemology that is necessarily unsettling, anti-hegemonic, anchored to the political goals of anti-colonial liberation, and works against the accumulation and reproduction of dominating histories. Such perspectives also reject the privileging of dualism, universal truths, and the normalization of dominant Euro-descendant epistemologies that actively work to silence, invisibilize, and delegitimate other ways of knowing and constructing meaning about the world. Knowledge matters. Perhaps one of the most distinct signposts for me of a decolonial epistemology has to do with the meaning of land. What I've learned over the years from leaders like LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, the founder of the Sacred Stone Camp at Standing Rock, and Frida Hewson, a Unistoten leader fighting against the Coastal GasLink pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory in northern British Columbia, is that resistance to extractive fossil fuel projects is not just a struggle over the preservation of the environment. The land upon which the Oceti-Sakowin and the Wet'suwet'en people have lived for hundreds of years is life itself. It is home. It is memory. It is the keeper of ancestral stories and intergenerational truths. It provides sustenance and medicines in the everyday. It marks time. It offers creative guidance and makes certain kinds of ceremonies possible. It teaches. It adapts. It produces life. And it carries the ecological, social, and political history upon which a peoples move into the future. Susan Hill remarks in The Clay We Are Made Of, Haudenosaunee Land Tenure on the Grand River, that, quote, for the Haudenosaunee, land is possibly the best point of reference for considering history. Historical knowledge and lessons embodied in the Haudenosaunee cultural history demonstrate land and territory as the primary determinants of Haudenosaunee identity. So if one seeks to understand Haudenosaunee history, one must consider the history of Haudenosaunee land. When we think of land through the resistance efforts of Indigenous communities, then, we are immediately confronted with questions of colonialism, of occupation, of domination, and multiple forms of epistemic violence that quite literally fuel the transformation of the environment. We are forced to ask, what would it mean to put the land first? Putting the land first, however, requires that we understand one another and our divergent and shared conceptions of the world. To say this another way, in order to push our politics of solidarity further, we have to refuse the desire to isolate alongside a refusal of the messiness and limitations of identity politics, of which I'm sure we're all familiar, that will always seek to divide instead of bring us together. We need people who are pushing the boundaries of environmental movements to speak across divergent but shared colonial histories, contemporary formations of racial state violence, and the ongoing devastation of settler colonialism, colonial gender violence, and anti-Black racism in places like the United States. And we also need people who can identify the way these forms of colonial violence exist as a part of a larger imperial web that reaches far beyond national borders. African-American composer and activist Bernice Reagan's oft-cited speech, Coalition Politics, Turning the Century, offers counsel here about why this matters so much. We need coalitions because movements that exist in relation to one another are stronger for it. We need them to ensure survival. Perhaps what we will gain from a multiracial and anti-colonial feminist coalition then is an emerging architecture of decolonization and practice of solidarity that produces new political ecologies that are reflective of this historical moment. In turn, this holds the potential to illustrate points of alignment and intersection, thus enabling the identification of common goals and paving the way for unification across distinct social and historical geographies. States do their best to carry out projects of colonialism and imperialism, but the people are never conquered. And as such, those of us persevering for a better world must also conduct our political organizing around climate change in a way that actively works to bring people together, addressing colonialism at home and abroad. Finally, because organizing against climate change is a future-oriented project, it is one that demands and requires durable and deep relationships. This means that we need to commit to resurrecting the idea and practice of solidarity by pulling it back from the clutches of oversimplification and empty overuse. In the parlance of Palestinian writer Stephen Salaita, Solidarity requires ethical commitments to function and does not involve appropriation. It is performed in the interest of better human relationships and for a world that allows societies to be organized around justice rather than profit. This is the kind of solidarity we must seek to bring into existence. We have to ask ourselves then to identify the processes and practices that will allow us to build real understanding and materialist analysis while centering a common interest of survival that is informed by notions of reciprocity, of empathy, and humility, reminiscent of the Zapatistas' idea of asking questions while walking. We have to be able to see one another and to recognize the individual and collective struggles that, taken together, are threatening the continuation of life itself. We have to be willing to listen and receive a rigorous education and simultaneously be eager to teach, to share, to trust, and to invest ourselves in a future that elevates mutual validation and recovers a sense of dignity through resistance. Philosopher Esme Murdoch reminds us of this realignment so powerfully when she says, quote, there is a whole messy and beautiful place waiting for us where we fuck up and make it right and fuck up and make it right by holding each other responsible in the strength and terror of becoming and making kin, end quote. This means returning to a practice of solidarity and in return, returning to feminist pedagogies of dialogue and listening that is not simply about highlighting the intersections among things, but also, and perhaps more significantly, emphasizing relations of mutuality and co-implication. I'm heartened by the words of anti-colonial feminist Chandra Mohanty, who asserts that this solidarity perspective requires understanding historical and experiential specificities and differences of people's lives, as well as the historical and experiential conditions between people from different racial and cultural communities and social and political geographies. What are the conditions, the knowledges, and the sensibilities that make this kind of dialogue possible? How can we craft dialogic spaces that are rooted in equality, respect, and dignity for all peoples in order for us to actively create a world we collectively want? A relationality of this type has the power to activate. It moves us towards political organizing and praxis because it reminds us that we are, in fact, capable of crafting relationships with our relatives, human and other than human, that are built on mutual respect and interdependency. All of this reminds me of a line I read in an introduction to a special issue of Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society, a journal that was published at the University of Toronto for several years, and the special issue is centered on water politics. And in the piece, Indigenous feminists Melanie Yazzie and Kutcha Rising Balding, the co-editors of the special issue, write, "It is in our interdependencies and reciprocities that we derive our greatest power and secure a future for all." But to do this, we have to be honest with ourselves about our culpabilities and responsibilities that we carry, and be open to altering our comprehension of the problems we are facing, and in turn, be ready to shift our ideas about the solutions that would be most effective in the context of a rapidly shrinking timeline. We have to both harness and give up some of our power. Science alone will not save us, and neither will government policy, UN meetings, or climate summits, where we expect world leaders to stand up and unify around the changes that we so desperately need. We cannot ameliorate this problem by promoting better consumer choices that privilege individual behavioral change, or by supporting the corporations peddling sustainable products. There is no magical technology that is going to allow things to return to normal. The green billionaires do not have the answers, and there is no fantasy island that we can swim to that will offer a climate reset. We require a revolutionary plan of action that is generated by a global people's movement and guided by a set of shared political commitments and ways of relating to one another that can withstand the immense uncertainty of this moment, a plan that is grounded in the dynamics of the here and now and committed to a just future, liberated from the shackles of climate apocalypse. The road forward is not easy, but making the decision to step onto it is perhaps the thing that matters most in this moment, because it signals an attachment to the idea that something else is possible, that we have not conceded or given up, that we are willing to keep trying. And in the end, our ability to stand together is one of the greatest weapons of hope and resistance we have.
about the phrase, we do not need more evidence. Like we have had enough evidence. We need to move to some other land of action. I start with my first question, and then everybody. I wonder if we, over the 2 days, we have seen different presentations, and they are all about different types of crises. So my first question, when I was listening to your topic, was how we made a franchise of crises. We open a new crisis in different locations. That was my first thought. And my question pertains to accountability. What place has accountability in this radical action, or in addressing radical action that you are thinking? Do we need to hack the systems of accountability currently in place to construct another type of power that is not connected to land grab with that was my first question. Since the conference is called Defending the Land, I really enjoy when you talk about land and different conceptions about land, because this almost the theology of meaning that begins with the conquest is that land is something to give you profit and take and use and discard, but native communities have taken land, as we know, in another way. It's a relation, and in the current situation, it's not a relation. We keep talking about the relation to land, but we are not relating to land. We are using and abusing.
Well, I'm actually happy to have more of a conversation, and I certainly don't need to sit at the center of this, and I also don't have all the answers, clearly. None of us do. That's the power of collective conversation, I guess. But I guess one thing that I'll say, and then again, I really hope others jump in, because I'm sure based on your presentations and experiences over the last 2 days, you have some things that you would like to share too that I'm sure you've been thinking about. For me, the questions around accountability are a little bit anchored to another set of questions about accountability to whom, and for what purpose. And so I think part of what those of us that have been thinking about, like, what it means to construct coalitions and spaces where people come together to try to understand and then develop a plan of action based on shared understanding of perhaps divergent, sometimes competing histories, is that you kind of craft the accountability in alignment with action. So it sits sort of at the center of a praxis orientation, that it doesn't sort of fall from the sky as a list of guidelines, but it's sort of generated in the process of learning and developing an agenda, a political agenda for building a social movement, for crafting a set of political goals, for attempting to achieve an outcome. And I think your first comment, which is about how there are all these different situations across the world that can be conceived of as crisis, is exactly my point, or one of the points I'd like to make, is that they're all actually connected, right? They don't operate in isolation from one another. Right, even though we understand them as distinct catastrophes or problems that are, physically and geographically disconnected from one another. But I think part of the work that we have to do is to understand how these things are co-constituted, co-constructed, and actually depend on each other in order for them to exist in the ways that they do.
I was kind of thinking in connection with what Laura was saying with the previous presentation we have from Secate, an activist group who have been putting in place many of the thoughts from Paulo Freire, and his pedagogy of the press, and they have really had significant success by developing this pedagogy in action.
Yeah.
And we also have heard other presentations, like Rosa was explaining, for example, for work children in Oaxaca, with some organizations and associations, the case of Colombia, and everything seems to be completely outside the academia, and I want to go to the academia to start thinking, even your library that you were describing and talking your project, it's outside the academia.
The bookstore,
The
yeah,
bookstore,
yeah, yeah.
So in that case, it looks like we're completely renouncing the idea that in the academia could be something happening. I still don't want to, and if something can happen in a very minor or major way, what can be done in terms of us as scholars, of us as pedagogists, of us as... So, I still don't want to drop all the faith in academia, but I'm getting to that point, no? So maybe some thoughts like...
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the questions that you're asking are questions that keep me up at night also, and many of my friends and comrades who are in academia and are struggling to think about the immense responsibility we feel like we carry, having acquired these positions that basically allow us to, to teach, to produce knowledge, to bring people together, to occupy, in the U.S., people don't value intellectualism, but in other parts of the world it's still valued. But that we actually have a space to be able to think and to plan. So I think it carries a tremendous amount, these positions carry a tremendous amount of responsibility, and I don't want to give up on them either. I think at the organizational level, at the institutional level, it's very difficult to shift them. But I do think there's a great deal we can do by, building relationships and collaborations with like-minded people that have similar political goals, and some institutions allow you to do this better and more effectively than others. And then also using our pedagogic spaces. Again, some universities allow you to do this better than others. Because every time you step into a classroom and you teach a group of students, you have the ability to shift their access to knowledge, to shift the way they think about a set of political questions. And it's a tremendous amount of labor to do that kind of teaching and to carry that kind of political responsibility with your pedagogy. But I think it's one of the places that we have some control in terms of how we, and again, it varies on, it depends on who you are, how many risks you're willing to take, what your department is like, and all of those things are sort of dependent on a particular university or college or location. But for me, I can say that I entered the New School with a very clear political position on many things, and I never compromised on those things. I basically was very clear. I figured, everyone's like, don't say anything until you're tenured, whatever, the sort of golden rule in academia, don't be too political, don't rock too many boats, don't do this, do that. I took the opposite approach, which was, I'm going to be as outspoken about my politics as I can be, because then I'm going to be easily identified. If something goes wrong and I have like all these things sort of lined up in accordance with what they tell me have to be lined up, it's going to be a lot harder to come after me. It's going to be clear that they're coming after me for political reasons. So I just was uncompromising in my political positions, and I worked hard to make that known, and was able to craft like a space for myself. Not easily all the time, for sure. It's messy, it's difficult, it's fraught, it's it's problematic and troublesome on many days. But it's also the space I have access to right now. But I also don't believe it's the only space, right? So that's why I'm spending energy also building a community bookstore and social center where I feel like people come together in a different way, And so it's another access point. It's another possibility of connection, of building relationships, of getting to know one another. And it's pretty amazing to see what happens to people's sense of rhythm and time, and also like how they see themselves when they enter a space like that. Now we have like the sort of arc of a year to sort of step back and see kind of and reflect on kind of what happens. It's definitely different, but I don't know. That's those are some like preliminary thoughts.
Thank you so much for your talk. Pardon our tardiness. We were actually at your bookstore.
Oh.
In Philadelphia. It was amazing, and we made sure to purchase quite a bit of things.
Oh, thank you for going. That's great.
Of course, it was amazing. But talking about the burden that we have and, coalitions and work that is tiresome but also daunting to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
My question isn't so much about your or our work, but more so how do you maintain self-care when engaging with material that's so draining,
Mm-hmm.
and can feel like there's not much hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh boy. That's a tough one too. Well, I think I find respite in collective spaces, and I try to think about questions of self-care at a collective level. In addition to obviously doing things for myself like exercise and like reading fiction and other things that allow me to stay grounded and centered. But I think that so much of our world is mediated by technology. So much of it is mediated by like the pressure and time. We were talking about this last night, right? About the deadlines of like thinking about time and capitalist time in particular ways that force you to structure your day and to manage your world in ways that make you productive, that make you like a productive member of society, whatever that means. It means, supporting the fossil fuel industry and other things, whatever it is that you end up sort of doing. And I think again, I'll say like, I think stepping into collective spaces that operate with a sense of like mutuality and reciprocity and understanding just allows some of that to fall away, even if it's momentary or, time limited. And it makes the sort of confrontation with the kind of atomized world in which we live in on a daily basis a little bit more tenable, which could be conceived of as a form of self-care or at least management of a situation that's difficult to sidestep and get out of. Yeah. Yeah. But it's a long haul, it's heavy. Some of this work is incredibly heavy, and there's no easy way to do it. There's no easy way to study colonial gender violence. There's no easy way to study the devastation of the planet and the relationship between those things, right? It requires a kind of head-on confrontation with what it is in order for you to be able to understand it, I think, and think about how you want to enter a process of like, how you want to help to sort of create and support a movement or an architecture around decolonization. You have to understand it. And power's tricky, it morphs, it changes, it alters itself. And so there's also always, for me, the constant work of trying to understand our world and the ways that it adapts and changes over time in order to be able to figure out how these problems are constructed and then how best to think about what it means to collectively intervene.
Thank you, Jaskiran, I have many questions, but I'm going to try not to build up too much. So my main concern is about your what you said about like the political ecology,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I really enjoyed when you were speaking. And I think it's central to the question that also asked about the role of academia today here. But I would say also it's related to the question of science also, that we have been speaking a lot about this yesterday and today. And knowledge, you spoke about colonial knowledge, and to me this is one of the questions, for instance, today is we have, I guess, I'm sure you know that the last weeks we had this scientist rebellion, all these people coming out and saying that we're going to go to move to an action, right? And this, I would say, this is people who are also taking a different path than going from outside academia and trying to create a dialogue with people, with scholars. This is more scholars who usually were more enclosed in very specific disciplinary discussions about geology, about very scientific questions. Sometimes it's very complex and technique. And these people, when you follow them now, you feel like they are, because you were speaking about the evidences that we have, but we don't have. These evidences don't translate in a political action. And you see the science moving to politics, right? And to me, this is one of the things that have been, like, to me, very important in the last year, and particularly from the last IPCC report that has created this broader debate. And I was reading, I'm going to read just one of the, to me, because I've been reading the IPCC report, and I think the one of this year is very important for the question of political ecology, and you have been speaking about that. This is why, and it's the question of why we don't have a translation of this evidence to the political action, and it's the sentence of the interaction between politics, economics, and power relationships is central to explain why broad commitments do not always translate to urgent action. This sentence has been commented a lot in media after, because it's in the IPCC. And when you read that, this was in the big report. It has been raised from the summary, because for questions of group of interest trying to remove these important observations. And when I think about that, I think it's simple. I mean, I don't have the answers. You said that this before, I'm thinking also a lot about all these questions. And when you were speaking about colonial ecology, the colonial knowledge, I think it's something about, I think it's something key in thinking not only in terms of how local communities and indigenous knowledge, which is of course very important, can communicate about that, but it's also from the science how they are changing and thinking our own ways of interacting no longer are useful to address these problems.
Right.
So I don't know what you think about that. I mean, I had this one. I was listening to your ideas about colonial knowledge. And,
yeah. No, I mean, I think that. I think part of it is that how do you change your own forms of engagement and sort of approach to thinking about action based on the knowledge you have access to and the kinds of exposure that you have, right? So for me, when I see, and my oldest daughter is training to be a climate scientist, so I've been steeped in the climate science world since she was 13, and now she's at Berkeley working in a climate science lab en route to a PhD. And so when she first became interested, and this is sort of a side story, but I'll speed through it quickly, but it's relevant. I'll tie it back in a second. When she first became interested in climate science, I got really worried. Like, she was interested in organizing, and she started organizing like girls' climate summits at her school and in middle school and high school. And I became really kind of concerned that she was going to be informed only by the dominant environmental justice movement, right, which offers these very homogenized renditions of the Anthropocene and offer nothing about the histories of colonialism as they relate to capitalism and environmental justice. And so she, I took her up north to the Northwest Territories, just south of the Arctic Circle, where I'm close to a Dene family and a long-standing indigenous environmentalist in that community who I'm really close to. And she drove with me. She did the 20-hour drive from Calgary all the way up to the Northwest Territories, so traversed the entire landscape, and then spent, 2 weeks there with him, listening to him tell his stories about indigenous organizing in the fight for moratoriums on pipelines in the north, return of lands that were supposed to be included in treaties but were not, and her world just opened up in terms of building an understanding of what environmental justice actually means. And I think that what's happening in some scientific circles, and I wouldn't say all of this, but I also am, I know some of the indigenous feminist scientists who've been pushing the boundaries of Western science frameworks. I think there is starting to be a recognition that the ways that we've conducted science, the way that we've thought about knowledge production, and the ways that they have been isolated from larger questions about the world are like no longer effective. Not only are they no longer effective, they're not going to save the generations that are coming after us. So I think there's now this sort of realization that everyone is going to be implicated in this set, which is a little bit about what we were talking about before we did the talk. And so I think, you have mainstream scientists who are saying like, look, we don't know, our grandchildren, our children are asking us questions about what's happening on the planet and where. So I think it's sort of, there are all of these forces that are working at the same time. I think we have to be careful about, and I've written about this and spoken about this also, the way that, indigenous knowledge systems become co-opted and integrated and used in sort of the service of global climate recovery without, addressing questions of sovereignty and land rights and, all the, devastating forms of slow violence that indigenous communities continue to face all over the globe. So I think, those are some things that come to mind immediately.
Seems to be that decolonizing epistemology would also demand decolonizing our approaches, right?
Yes.
To not think that we got the path to the solution.
Yes.
To keep questioning that is the solution. But it's impossible not to think about the violence that it's employed in maintaining this profit.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely.
I wonder if in tune with the self-care question, what is a sustainable plan of action? Because dying is not sustainable either for the cause. Right? So what would be the type of power? I mean, it can be sustainable too, but I don't talk that. Talking about the colonizing solution. But what did your daughter learn in this? Because she kept doing activism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there new solutions that we have explored? I'm thinking about, you mentioned your dinner friend, and I thought about, I think Anti-Colonial, that wrote an article which is called Beyond Environmentalism, which exactly says what you just said, we need to stop putting the native peoples in all this cosmogonic magic way and fight for their justice, that they have the right to the land. And if we fight for the right to the land, then we will be in a good path, because then from there everything goes better, right?
Right.
So, sorry. Is there a solution to this violence that necessarily will come your way if you try to oppose these multinationals, these corporations, this corruption? Do you think?
You mean the sort of the risk that one takes when you confront head-on, like through frontline land defense, or
there is a way to deconstruct their plan of actions. From my point of view, it doesn't look like what
Well, I think, I write about this in relationship to, settler state violence and, threats to settler state sovereignty, right? Of course, as soon as a state or a corporation feels as though their ability to accumulate capital is under threat, they respond with violence, because that's the, most immediate form of action that will quell a resistance. But I've seen, I think that people have the ability to organize in all kinds of inventive and incredible ways in the face of immense devastation. And I think you're not always victorious in the sense that you stop a pipeline, or that you, you're able to alter the, material conditions or colonial relations of domination to the degree that you want. But I do believe that all of those kind of political strategies and forms of action cumulatively over time put us towards a better path than we're on now. So, I don't have an answer to how do you deal with the, the threat of violence that will always come in your direction if you speak out and stand in solidarity with. But people are already doing that work of putting themselves on the line.
I was thinking maybe in response to Laura's question, that one of the strategies that I think was very effective was the Zapatista movement.
Yeah.
The first rebellion cibernética in the world, even before the Seattle 1999, the Zapatistas created the internet in Mexico.
Yeah.
They were the very first ones to have the website. They were the very first ones to communicate their policies outside the Mexican landscape and having international visitors coming and learning from them. So I think that's one of the most spectacular ways of visualizing their demands and also finding allies from all over the world. This kind of internationalism that you're describing.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
And in many ways that gave the government less opportunities to harm the Zapatista movement because there were international people watching and protecting those communities and living within those communities. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to learn from that kind of resilience.
For sure.
They're like masters of
They are masters at communication. No, I teach a class on internationalism and decolonial movements for liberation, and we spent, my students, most of whom had never heard of the Zapatistas, we spent, 6 weeks studying the Zapatistas in the fall semester, and I think across the board, every student was like, how do we not know this? Those of us that are engaged and interested in political organizing, how do we not know that there's this movement that we can learn from that has done all of these, has engaged all of these different forms of political strategy to be able to advance a set of political goals that is very similar to what many people want now. So so I'm absolutely with you. And I do think that's a great example of the kinds of media and communications that look slightly different now, but that is possible. And I will say, it's hard not to feel utterly devastated and hopeless in this situation when you're thinking about, the violence of government, of states and corporations. But there's a really amazing book written by a geographer that I teach sometimes in a class I teach at the New School on Indigenous Politics and Resurgence in Climate Justice, and it's called Grounded Authority, the Algonquins of Barrier Lake Against the State, and it's about a very, very small community of Algonquin people that kind of live at the intersection of the Quebec and Ontario border that are contesting both the corporation and the government. And it traces in really, really intricate detail the architecture of their political resistance. And it's 2,000 people going up against the Canadian government, the RCMP, the military, and a number of corporations, and dealing with 2 different provincial governments at the same time. And it is such an inspiring story. And this is a community that obviously has been devastated by colonialism for hundreds and hundreds of years, and is able to mount this resistance campaign to defend their territory in the wake of ongoing state encroachment on reservation lands and treaty lands. So I think, my hope is we bring people together that can, help to remind us of these things, that we can sort of think through questions of what it means to develop a social movement that has these various facets.
Yeah, how to replicate, right?
Yeah.
I think our frustration as being in academia, scholarship, is that we have all these set of tools, knowledge, and information, but we are so constrained by say, colonial structures.
Yeah.
And I keep Laura's comment, overlords, the master's tools are not gonna dismantle the master's house. And we keep going in circles, and we were discussing before, we have the luxury to discuss these things here, while other places are living consequences.
Yeah.
So how do we transmit that urgency to, I don't know, to our immediate communities, to families, and like those instances are amazing. Like those resistances that I think with what we are facing is not enough. And we know that, right? And then, like you said, like being in classes, like, yeah, inspiring students is amazing, but then I cannot help but think that they go to the next class, the economy class, or I don't know, business class, and all of that is like, you know, okay. And the academy is so extractive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Even in terms of knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, in every way, energy, knowledge, like, you know, all the things we are talking here about our countries, it's been taken advantage for imperialistic purposes.
Yeah, and they're also disciplinary institutions, right? So people change in them through the process of being disciplined. So, you know.
Yeah, and that's why I agree with you that resistance is helpful. It's sad because I gave my life to this, but it's not going to be here, it's going to be other microbes.
Yeah.
Well, we're human beings. We function in society. Right? It's not that we only function in academia. We exist.
Multiplicity.
Yeah, no, but I think it's an important question, right? How do you translate these local experiences of resistance to global policies? Like you were speaking about the COP26, which was very frustrating to see how political actors are working for the capital, and we don't have a real interest in addressing the crisis that we are facing. So all these local experiences of resistance are very informative, I think, and I can give us a lot of input, but we need a translation of that experience and of all the evidences that we have, right? And that's the problem that we are facing today. I would say if we want to be optimistic about that, I see a broader sectors of society trying to, or more sort of a growing consciousness about the problem, you can say, right? I would say, this is my impression of this. But nothing changes, it's always like, in terms of the politics.
Yeah.
We have always the same corporations investing millions, if not billions, to have this propaganda about how to keep doing the business as usual, right? And that's a problem. So to me, you were speaking, and Laura said about violence, for instance. And one of the things that some people are thinking about is about acting through violence in terms of like a resistance.
Oh yeah, violence.
There is this, and you have even scholars like Andreas Malm speaking about this book on how to blow up a pipeline.
How to blow up a pipeline,
All this, I don't know what you think about these approaches. I mean, there are...
Fire with fire.
I take my cues from the South African anti-apartheid movement, which is like, the terms of the game, if the terms of the game change, you be left with no choice but to, like, change your political strategy. So, I think, I think we have a lot to learn from, again, like, I look outside of North America to think about the ways that, and there's a whole set of political questions one can ask about what South Africa looks like in this moment post-apartheid. But there are movements historically that we can look to that have dealt with these same questions, have contended with these major political decisions about what strategy and organization looks like in the face of, the scale of this is enormous in terms of environmental crisis and planetary devastation. So, yeah.